Dr. Cresswell Vane raised his hand, not to ask a question, not to slow the conversation, to end it. Tamsin Oduya Crane was 4 words from finishing her sentence, 4 words from completing a field assessment she had built, breath by breath, in the back of Unit 7 at 60 miles an hour, and he raised his hand the way a man raises his hand at something that doesn't require his full attention. "Field personnel," he said, turning to the 2 residents behind him, sometimes pattern matched to the dramatic. He didn't look at her when he said it. He was already moving to the monitor. She had arrived at 1907, 2 minutes ahead of the ETA she'd called in. She'd pushed it because she'd been watching Harold Greer's right eye for the last 4 minutes of the drive, and the eye had told her something the monitors were still catching up to. Harold Greer was 67 years old, retired city planner. His wife had found him at the kitchen table at 1841, trying to say her name and producing something that wasn't quite sound. She had called 911 immediately, which meant Tamsin had something most stroke patients never give you: a precise, witnessed onset time. 1841. That number was not incidental. In ischemic stroke management, onset time is the hinge on which everything turns. The thrombolytic window, the period during which TPA can be administered to dissolve a clot and potentially reverse catastrophic neurological damage, closes at 4.5 hours from last known well. Tamsin knew the window. She had been calculating it since the moment she crouched beside Harold Greer's kitchen chair. She had 26 minutes of margin when she walked through those doors. She had run the NIH stroke scale in the field. Score of 14, severe. Right facial droop, confirmed. Expressive aphasia, confirmed. Harold could understand her, she was certain of that, but the words were trapped somewhere between his mind and his mouth, coming out blunted and wrong. Blood pressure 178/104. Field glucose stick, normal. No hypoglycemia, no metabolic explanation for what she was looking at. She knew what she was looking at. She had been looking at it for 6 years. Charge nurse Petra Soland was already at the terminal when Tamsin came through. That was the thing about Petra. She was always already there, compact, efficient, watching. She had the stillness of someone who had cataloged every kind of wrong a hospital corridor could produce, and she cataloged this one too, in real time, as Tamsin began to speak. NIHSS 14, witnessed onset 1841, right facial droop, expressive aphasia present, BP 178/104, glucose normal on field stick. Petra's fingers moved without hesitation. Every word entered, every word time-stamped. The EPCR terminal recorded the intake at 1907. Tamsin kept going, lateralizing signs, gaze deviation, the specific quality of Harold Greer's aphasia, the fact that his comprehension appeared intact even as his expression failed him. She spoke the way she always spoke in a handoff, precisely, in order, without editorializing. 6 years of this had compressed her into something efficient. She didn't perform urgency, she communicated it. She was 3 sentences from done. The curtain moved. Dr. Cresswell Vane entered Bay 4 the way he always entered a room, as though the room had been waiting for him and had been getting along adequately until now. White coat open, reading glasses up. The 2 residents, both of them second years, stepped back automatically, the way residents do around certain attendings. Not from respect exactly, from habit. He didn't look at Harold Greer first, he looked at the monitor. Then he raised his hand toward Tamsin and the room shifted. "Field personnel," he said to the residents, "sometimes pattern match to the dramatic. What we actually have here," he was already moving to the keyboard. He dictated his own assessment directly into the chart. Metabolic encephalopathy, probable hypoglycemic episode. And then, this was the part that would matter later, though no one in the room knew it yet. He added a specific line, a documented line. Field diagnosis of ischemic stroke not supported by clinical presentation. His words, his voice, his timestamp. 1912. 5 minutes after Petra had entered Tamsin's assessment into the same record. Tamsin stood at the foot of the gurney, hands at her sides. She waited until Vane paused for breath, and then she said it clearly, without heat, the way she said everything. "He was last known well at 1841, doctor. You're inside the window." Vane turned his back, not after she finished. Mid-sentence. He turned to the residents and began explaining his differential, and Tamsin's voice simply ceased to exist in the room, the way a door ceases to exist once it has been closed. One of the residents, the taller one, second year, a careful face, shifted his weight. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His right hand moved to his coat pocket and found a small notebook there, and he uncapped something, and he wrote. Nobody noticed. Nobody was watching him. She walked out, not because she was finished, because she understood, with the same clarity she brought to every field assessment, that staying would accomplish nothing a clock couldn't accomplish on its own. She passed the wall clock on her way out of Bay 4, 1914. The TPA window had opened at 1841. It would close at 2311. Vane had just spent 7 minutes of that window, overruling her. And Tamsin Oduya Crane walked down the corridor knowing, with the same certainty she'd had in Harold Greer's kitchen, exactly what 7 minutes meant for a blocked middle cerebral artery. If you believe the truth always finds its way to the surface, that precision and documentation matter, that the quiet ones are sometimes the ones who have already done the work, then this is your place. The people who keep coming back to this channel know that justice doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives on a timestamp. Subscribe and stay with this story. Every chapter is already written. The bay door sealed behind her with a hydraulic hiss, and the night air hit cold. Tamsin didn't move toward the cab. She stood against the unit and let the cold settle in, because cold was clarifying, and right now she needed clarity more than warmth. She ran it again. Not because she doubted it, she ran it because doubt was what Vane had just planted in that room, quietly, in front of 2 residents and a charge nurse, and she knew how that kind of thing grew if you didn't look directly at it. Harold Greer, 67, onset witnessed at 1841, right facial droop, expressive aphasia. He'd been mid-sentence when it happened, his wife said, trying to tell her something about the television. NIHSS 14. BP 178/104. Field glucose unremarkable. She had put her penlight in his right eye and watched the left side of his face do nothing, and she had known, not guessed, not pattern matched to the dramatic, as Vane had told those residents. She had known, with the particular certainty that comes from having run this call enough times that the body tells you before the chart does. She was still running it when she heard boots on the wet asphalt behind her. Kwaku had the look he always got when he'd heard something through the bay window and was deciding how much of it to say. He stopped beside her, didn't open with a question, just waited. So she walked him through it. Every beat, in sequence, the way she would have finished saying it to Petra if Vane hadn't raised his hand. Onset time, deficits, vitals, the glucose stick, the NIHSS score and what it pointed to. She kept her voice level, the same register she used on scene. Not because she was performing composure, but because the information was the point, and emotion was noise around it. Kwaku listened without interrupting, which was its own kind of answer. When she finished, he said, "That's a clean call, Tam. That's a textbook call." She didn't say anything. "I'm serious," he said. "You know they're using your Greer-type documentation as the model set for the regional conference. Adkins mentioned it last week. Said the state EMS medical director's office has been looking at your case files." He said it the way he always said things like that, not to flatter, but because it was relevant and he thought she should have the full picture. The handoff protocol presentation. They want you on the panel. Tamsin absorbed that without comment. It wasn't the moment for it. What it meant, she filed away, not discarded, filed. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the field notebook. It was the same one she'd carried for 11 months. Spiral-bound, olive green cover, the corners worn soft from the chest pocket. She opened it to Greer's page. Her pre-arrival notes were there in her own handwriting. The dispatch summary, the scene assessment, the clinical findings, the NIHSS scoring grid filled in by hand before they had even loaded him. She had written LMCA pattern, stroke, ischemic, probable, with a small circle around it, the way she always circled a working diagnosis so it stood out when she reviewed later. She looked at those notes for a moment. Then she reached for her mobile tablet mounted to the unit's side panel and pulled up the EPCR system. The upload confirmation receipt sat at the top of the record, 1854, 13 minutes before they had rolled through the ER doors. 13 minutes before Vane had walked into Bay 4 and dictated his own assessment into the chart. Her diagnosis, the full clinical picture, the NIHSS score, the onset time, the working impression, had been in the system before he had ever laid eyes on Harold Greer. She stared at that timestamp for a moment longer than necessary. Then she locked the tablet and looked up. Through the bay window, she could see Bay 4. Dr. Cresswell Vane was still in there. He was standing with his back half turned to the patient, one hand gesturing at the monitor, addressing both residents with the unhurried authority of a man who had never been wrong in front of an audience and did not intend to start. One of the residents was nodding, the other was writing something down. Harold Greer lay in the bed behind them. No imaging cart, no radiology tech, no CT order cued on the board she could see from here. Vane gestured again at the monitor, unhurried. She knew the window. Every paramedic who had ever run a stroke call knew the window. 4.5 hours from confirmed onset to TPA administration, but the real number, the number that separated good outcomes from the other kind, was the first 90 minutes. After that, every minute was a percentage point, and not the kind that moved in a favorable direction. She had handed Vane the onset time. She had handed him the NIHSS. She had put the window in his hands at 1907 and said, clearly, "You're inside it." He had turned his back and kept talking. Kweku's voice came from beside her, quiet. "It's been 22 minutes. Tamsin didn't answer, because she was already doing the math on what 22 minutes meant for a blocked middle cerebral artery. 22 minutes. For a blocked middle cerebral artery, that number isn't an inconvenience, it's a countdown. Every 60 seconds of ischemia, roughly 2 million neurons go dark, a figure that doesn't come from a textbook Tamsin read once. It comes from the kind of calls that stay with a paramedic, the ones where the window closed before the door ever opened. She knew the window. She had known it at 1841, standing in Harold Greer's kitchen, watching his right hand drift when she asked him to hold it up. She had known it at 1854, when she typed the last line of her field assessment into the EPCR terminal on the dash of Unit 7 and hit upload, 13 minutes before they rolled through the bay doors of Mercy General. And she knew it now, at 1936, watching the lights of Bay 4 burn steady and unhurried through the ambulance bay window. Inside, Vane was still holding court. He had the posture of a man who had never once been wrong in a room, one hand gesturing at the monitor. A measured pause before each sentence, the kind of pause designed to make residents feel they were receiving something rare. He had not ordered imaging. There was no radiology slip on the board. There was no CT pending. What there was, what had been sitting in the hospital's own system since 1854, was Tamsin's assessment. Filed, time-stamped, uploaded before Vane had ever set foot in Bay 4. NIHSS 14. Witnessed onset 1841. Right facial droop. Expressive aphasia. BP 178/104. Left MCA territory. Probable ischemic event. And at 1912, Dr. Cresswell Vane had opened the same chart and typed over it. Not around it, not below it, over it. His entry read, metabolic encephalopathy, likely hypoglycemic episode. Field diagnosis of ischemic stroke not supported by clinical presentation. His name, his timestamp, his words, dictated in front of two residents as though Tamsin's report were a rough draft he was correcting. He hadn't ignored her assessment. He had documented his disagreement with it, by name, in the permanent record, and then walked away from the window she had handed him. That distinction would matter. It just didn't matter yet. Petra Soland had been watching the board for the last 10 minutes. No CT order. No neuroconsult flagged. No imaging slip. She had the full picture of Bay 4 in the way charge nurses always do. Not from being in the room, but from watching what the room failed to produce. She pulled up the chart audit trail on her terminal. Every entry, every timestamp, every edit, in sequence from the moment Harold Greer's name hit the system. She read Tamsin's 1854 upload first. Then she read Vane's 1912 entry. Her expression didn't change. That was the thing about Petra Soland. She had spent 21 years cataloging the ways things went wrong in hospitals, and she had learned that the moment you let your face show what you know, you lose the advantage of knowing it. She scrolled back through the audit trail once more, slowly, reading each timestamp the way you read a contract when you suspect a clause has been altered. She walked to Bay 4. She didn't make it a confrontation. She asked, in the measured tone of someone managing a board, whether an imaging order was pending for the patient in Bay 4. Vane looked at her the way he had looked at Tamsin, not with hostility exactly, but with the particular impatience of a man who had decided, some years ago, that certain questions didn't require his full attention. He told her imaging wasn't indicated at this stage. She nodded once, said nothing further, and walked back to her station. She printed the full audit trail, every entry, every timestamp, every edit. 12 pages, fed quietly from the printer beside her terminal while the desk phone rang and 2 orderlies moved past with a supply cart and nobody looked at her. She folded the pages once, precisely along the center crease, the way you fold something you intend to keep flat and unambiguous, and slid them into the left pocket of her scrubs, beneath the badge lanyard. She did not tell anyone she had done this. She went back to managing the board. She was heading back out when the door opened from the inside. A second-year resident, young, slightly rumpled, the particular expression of someone who has just watched something happen and hasn't yet decided what to do about it. He was holding a spare BP cuff, hers, left on the gurney rail during the handoff. He handed it over without much ceremony and then paused, which was the thing that made Tamsin go still. He didn't say what he'd seen. He didn't say what Vane had said or how the residents had looked at each other when Vane turned his back on her mid-sentence. He just stood there for a moment, in the doorway between the hospital and the cold bay air, and then he uncapped the pocket notebook from his breast pocket and wrote something in it, 2 lines, maybe 3, and capped it again and walked back inside without explaining himself. Tamsin stood there a moment longer. She didn't know what he'd written. She didn't know about Petra's folded pages. She didn't know that the audit trail already existed, clean, sequential, irrefutable, sitting in a printer tray and then a scrub pocket and then, eventually, a quality review file. What she knew was this. At 1854, she had filed her assessment. At 1912, Vane had filed his. Those 2 entries were now sitting in the same permanent record, time-stamped 18 minutes apart, saying opposite things about the same patient. And one of them was going to be confirmed by imaging, if imaging was ever ordered. At 1947, 40 minutes after Tamsin's handoff, a radiology tech wheeled the portable CT unit toward Bay 4, and the number on the clock above the bay door read like a verdict. The scan came back at 1953, left middle cerebral artery, ischemic occlusion. The hyperdensity was clean, unambiguous, sitting exactly where Tamsin Oduya Crane had said it would be, in the territory she had described in 4 words on a gravel driveway at 1841, confirmed in a full NIHSS assessment in the back of Unit 7 by 1850, and uploaded to the EPCR system at 1854, 59 minutes ago. The chart had known before the building did. Petra read the result without moving. Then she looked at the clock above the bay door. Then she looked back at the screen. She did not say anything to the resident standing 2 feet away, because there was nothing to say that the timestamp hadn't already said. The neuro team was paged at 1954. The TPA clock was pulled up immediately, because that is what you do when a stroke patient is confirmed. You go back to the last known well time and you count forward. And what the neuro fellow found when she counted forward from 1841 was a number that made her go very quiet for a moment before she reached for the phone. The patient was still inside the window, not comfortably, not with margin to spare, but inside it, by a distance that the fellow later described in writing as clinically sufficient but narrowly so. The math was not complicated. The TPA administration window for an ischemic stroke runs to 4.5 hours from last known well. Harold Greer's last known well time was 1841. The window closed at 23:11. The neuro team had time. What they did not have was the 46 minutes between Tamsin's 1907 arrival and the 1953 scan. 46 minutes that had not been spent preparing for a stroke. They had been spent not preparing for one. Dr. Yummy Adora Finch was on the 3rd floor when her tablet vibrated. She had come in that evening for an unrelated audit, a medication reconciliation review that had nothing to do with Bay 4, nothing to do with Tamsin Oduya Crane, nothing to do with the man in the Navy uniform who had spent the last hour overruling a paramedic in front of residents. She had been reading through pharmacy logs. Then the alert came. The system had flagged it automatically. That was the part no one in Bay 4 had anticipated. Not Vane, not the residents, possibly not even Petra. Mercy General's quality review protocol included an automated trigger. If a field provider's time-stamped clinical assessment was explicitly contradicted by an attending's chart entry, and if subsequent diagnostic imaging confirmed the field assessment, the system generated an alert. It had been written into the protocol 2 years earlier, after a different incident in a different bay that no one liked to discuss directly. The trigger existed because someone had decided at some point that documentation needed to be able to speak for itself. Adora Finch read the alert twice, then she opened the full chart. The 1854 EPCR entry was the first clinical record in the file. Tamsin's upload, NIH SS14. Onset 1841, right facial droop, expressive aphasia, BP 178/104, had been sitting at the top of Harold Greer's chart since before he arrived. Below it, at 1907, was Petra's intake entry, transcribed word for word from Tamsin's verbal handoff. Below that, at 1912, was Vane's entry. Adora Finch read it the way you read something you want to make sure you have read correctly. Then she closed the chart, picked up her tablet, and walked toward the stairs. She did not take the elevator. Tamsin was still in the bay when the doors opened. She had not left. Kwaku had gone to restock the unit, and she had stayed because she knew the scan was coming back and she needed to know what it said. Not to be right, not for anything that could be named easily, but because Harold Greer was 67 years old and had been last known well at 1841, and she had been the one who had found him on that driveway, and she was not going to drive away until she knew. Petra came to her. Not Vane, not the neuro fellow, not the attending who had taken over the bay. Petra, who had entered every word of Tamsin's handoff into the system at 1907, who had printed the audit trail and folded it into her pocket, who had watched the clock the way Tamsin had watched it, walked out through the ambulance bay doors and crossed the wet pavement and stopped in front of her. She said, "The chart is going to quality review tonight. Your 1854 entry is the first line of the record. I need you to know that before anyone tells you otherwise." Tamsin held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, the way you nod when someone has just confirmed something you already knew but needed to hear said aloud by another person who was also in the room. Petra turned and walked back inside. Tamsin stood there for a moment longer. Somewhere in the building, Kwaku's voice had mentioned a regional conference, case files reviewed as model documentation, a standing invitation. She had not thought about that in hours. She thought about it now. Not with satisfaction, not yet, but with the particular clarity of someone who has just understood that the record they kept with care, on a driveway, in the back of a unit, before anyone was watching, was about to be read by everyone. Dr. Adora Finch walks into Bay 4 with her tablet, and Dr. Vane, for the first time all evening, goes very quiet. The quality review session was scheduled for 8 o'clock the following morning. Tamsin arrived at 7:53. She did not pace. She did not rehearse. She had already said everything she needed to say. Had said it, in fact, at 1854 the previous evening, in a field report uploaded from the back of Unit 7 before they ever reached the hospital doors. The record existed. It had a timestamp. Those two facts were the only preparation she required. Dr. Adora Finch opened the session the way she opened every review, without ceremony, without preamble, with the document itself. She laid out the audit trail on the projected screen and walked through it in chronological order, as though she were reading a bus schedule. Tamsin's EPCR upload, 1854. Full stroke assessment, NIH SS14. Witnessed onset 1841. Right facial droop, expressive aphasia, BP 178/104. Left MCA occlusion pattern identified in the field and entered into the system. Then she advanced the slide. Dr. Vane's chart entry, 1912. Metabolic encephalopathy, probable hypoglycemic episode. The paramedic stroke diagnosis, she read aloud, is, and here she paused just long enough for the room to understand she was quoting directly, not supported. Vane said nothing. He had the expression of a man waiting for the right moment to speak, still believing one would come. Adora Finch advanced the slide again. CT confirmation, 1953. Left MCA ischemic stroke. Occlusion pattern consistent in every particular with the field assessment entered at 1854. Then the TPA margin calculation, and here she read the number quietly, without inflection. The patient received thrombolytic intervention with 6 minutes remaining in the therapeutic window. 6 minutes. She noted, without editorializing, that this margin would not have existed had the field assessment been acted upon at time of arrival. The room was very still. Petra's printed audit trail was entered as a supporting exhibit. She had pulled it the night before, in silence, at her terminal. Every entry, every timestamp, every edit. And she had folded it into her scrub pocket and said nothing to anyone. It had seemed at the time like a small and private act. In the conference room, projected on the screen, it was a wall. Then, Adora Finch turned to the second exhibit. Dr. Leor Bassett had submitted his pocket notebook entry as a written witness account. He was not present in the room. Second years rarely were, but his handwriting was. Adora Finch read the relevant passage aloud. The exact phrase Vane had used when he raised his hand to stop Tamsin mid-sentence. The exact moment he turned his back. The exact words he dictated into the chart while she was still standing at the foot of the gurney. Bassett had written it down in real time, in the same reflex that makes good clinicians reach for a pen, because something in him had recognized in that moment that what he was watching should be witnessed. Vane cleared his throat. He said it had been a collaborative clinical discussion, that field assessments, however detailed, required attending confirmation before imaging protocols were initiated, that he had exercised appropriate clinical judgment in a high-pressure environment. Adora Finch let him finish. Then she turned the tablet so the timestamp column faced him and said, quietly, that the paramedic's diagnosis had been entered into the system at 1854, that he had accessed the patient chart at 1909, 3 minutes before dictating his override, that the field assessment was therefore in the record before he stepped into the bay, before he raised his hand, before he said the words that Bassett wrote down. She looked at him across the table. The paramedic's diagnosis was in the system before you saw the patient, Dr. Vane. That is the finding. She had been asked to present her field documentation methodology as a matter of record. She had done it in 4 minutes. The same voice, the same cadence. The same precision she had used standing at the foot of Harold Greer's gurney while a room full of people waited for her to be wrong. She had not been wrong. Vane had no response. The record already had one. Had always had one, from the moment she photographed her handwritten notes in the back of Unit 7 and hit upload, 13 minutes before they rolled through the hospital doors. He had dismissed a diagnosis he had already been given in writing. He had done it in front of witnesses, and one of those witnesses had reached for a notebook. The review board would determine next steps. There would be a process. There would be documentation. There was always more documentation. And it would move at the pace institutions move, which is slow and deliberate and, in the end, thorough. Walking out of the review room, Tamsin passed the same wall clock from Bay 4, and this time she didn't check it, because the time that matters is already written down. There is a version of this story where the ending is loud, where someone raises their voice, where there is a confrontation in a hallway, where justice arrives with noise and spectacle. That is not what happened. What happened is that a paramedic documented her work with precision. A charge nurse printed a piece of paper and said nothing. A second-year resident reached for his notebook, and a quality assurance officer read the timestamps aloud in a quiet room. What happened is that the truth had been in the system since 1854, and no one, not even the man who tried to overwrite it, could change what was already written. Harold Greer received his intervention. 6 minutes to spare. The margin was always there. Someone just had to hold the line long enough for the clock to prove it. If you believe that the quiet ones, the ones who document, who print the audit trail, who write it down, are the ones who change things in the end, leave a comment below. Tell us about a time someone underestimated your work and what happened when the record spoke for itself. This channel is for the people who know that the truth doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to be documented. Subscribe if you want to stay in that room with us. There's always another story where the timestamps tell the whole truth.